Hello, so I'm going to give an introduction to the afternoon session now. We covered a huge amount of material over the course of the morning there, and I know some of it was quite difficult. You might be feeling a little bit bamboozled by some of what you've just heard, but don't worry, we've got lots of time to pick up these various threads over the course of this afternoon and tomorrow morning. So I'm going to kind of focus our minds in on the questions that we're asking and then just see where we've got to in relation to those questions through the talks that we heard this morning. So the questions for this weekend are the ones that I mentioned at the start. So first of all, how should standards of ethical behavior be upheld? And particularly within that is political accountability, those mechanisms of political representation and accountability. Are they enough, or do we need something more to uphold ethical standards of behavior? And second, to what extent should government and parliament be subject to legal limits? And again, a couple of questions within that, one focusing in on parliament. So should there be limits on the laws that parliament can pass? And the other one focusing in on government. How do we ensure that government ministers act within their powers? So let's start off then with the first of those questions. How should standards of ethical behavior be upheld? So we've heard that one view in answer to that question is that we should uphold these standards of ethical behavior through politics, through choosing our representatives, holding the representatives to account, questioning in parliament, all these kinds of things. And I guess the argument in favor of this political approach is to say, I mean, there are various arguments, but kind of main argument is, well, voters ultimately are in charge there. So voters have control, and in a democracy, presumably that's quite important. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the view that actually we should have rules that are forcing standards of ethical behavior to be maintained, and that involves regulators and in some cases also courts. And again, there may be various arguments for this, but principal argument is there's a reasonable guarantee that there's going to be an impartial process, that it's not going to be subject to the partisan interests of those in power if you take it out of the political process. You have regulators and courts doing that work. So there are good arguments on both sides of the spectrum here. But the important thing for us to remember is it really is a spectrum. So there really is that range of views across between simply focusing in on politics and simply focusing in on rules-based systems. So there's a range of different approaches that we can take. And just where we put ourselves on that spectrum is going to depend on which of the standards of ethical behavior we might be talking about. So remember, Jane in the morning talked about those various Nolan principles, the different standards that we might expect people in public life to uphold. So just which of those we're focusing on will make a difference to how we answer that question. So say, for example, we're talking about corruption and concern that MPs have been guilty of behaving in a corrupt way. Well, that's a case where we really do have, at the moment, the UK is very much in the middle between relying on politics and relying on regulators and the courts. So if you think of the case of Owen Paterson, that MP recently, he was found to have been basically lobbying MPs on behalf of companies that were paying him. The process there of checking that starts off with the parliamentary commissioner, who's an independent person, and she is the person who conducts an investigation and reaches conclusions on what he's been doing. Then her report went to a parliamentary committee, that's half MPs, half people from outside politics, outside parliament. And they looked at the report, came to their own judgment that yes, indeed, he had been guilty of breaking the rules, and they imposed a penalty. And normally, that's then basically it. So then the final step is that the House of Commons as a whole votes to accept that report. And normally that happens very, very simply. So you have that mixture of the regulator and the politics getting involved. Now, in this particular case of Owen Paterson, the reason it became famous is that essentially the government stepped in and tried to stop the decision to suspend Owen Paterson. So the committee had recommended he should be suspended for 30 days. And the government stepped in and tried to stop that from happening. And then that led to a huge big backlash. And eventually the government was forced to U-turn and Owen Paterson resigned as an MP. So on the one hand, you might say, well, that kind of suggests that the system at the moment isn't strong enough. The government shouldn't have been able to try to step in and stop that suspension from going through. You might think we need to have a stronger role for regulators and rules in order to stop that from happening. On the other hand, you might say, well, actually, the political process worked there. The government tried to do something that really wasn't ethically appropriate, and there was a big backlash. Politics kicked in. There was a public outcry, a media outcry, and the government was forced to back down. So you can see those different mechanisms operating very clearly in that case, producing the outcome. If we think about a different principle, though, we will find ourselves somewhere else on that spectrum. So if we think, for example, about the principle of honesty and that politicians should speak truthfully and shouldn't be dishonest, well, the system is going to tend to be a bit more towards the end of relying on politics here, just because regulators tend to be very concerned about intervening in questions about what politicians are and are not allowed to say. It can get very heated, very contentious as to what is true and what is not true, what's misleading and what's not misleading. So on that kind of issue, relying on political accountability and people coming to their own judgment of what they make of the claims that are being made by different politicians is a bigger part of what we normally do. So that's how it works in the UK at the moment. Of course, the question for you is to consider, how should this work? How should this system of maintaining ethical standards operate? So that's the first question. Then the second question is, to what extent should government and parliament be subject to legal limits? And again, at one end of the spectrum, we have the view that the politics should dominate, that voters should be in charge and be able to control the outcomes. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the view that actually we need legal limits on what government and parliament can do, because we need protections so that those in power are not able to act against the interests of the rest of us, for example. So now this question, as we said in the morning, has kind of two areas of focus within it. So there's government there and there's also parliament. And just how things work at the moment in the UK is different, depending on whether we're talking about limits on government or limits on parliament. So let me start off with the question about parliament. And should there be legal limits on the laws that government can pass? So as Chris explained in his talk this morning, the traditional system in the UK is one in which politics dominates, in which we rely entirely on, or relied entirely on, those political mechanisms of representation and accountability, us choosing our representatives, Parliament operating and scrutinising what the executive is doing, and us being able to hold our representatives to account. So that was the traditional system in the UK. And of course, the argument for that is that's democracy. And we have this principle of parliamentary sovereignty, that Parliament can pass any law that it wishes. On the other hand, other democracies, Chris mentioned particularly the United States, but actually most democracies have this kind of system. The courts can really impose quite strong limits on what laws the Parliament can pass. And these are countries that have a fully written out constitution that sets out various requirements, various rules on rights and on how the democratic system will operate. And Parliament just can't straightforwardly pass any kind of law in order that would break those basic principles. And if it did try to do so, if a parliament in a country like that does try to introduce such laws, then the courts can strike down those laws. They can make those laws no longer be laws. They can just remove them from the list of laws. Now, the UK, as again Chris explained, has kind of moved over the last quarter century or so that now the UK is somewhere in the middle between these two different ends of the spectrum. And that's for several reasons. Chris mentioned several reasons for that. But maybe the most important one is the Human Rights Act. And that was a piece of legislation that was passed by Parliament in 1998. And in that piece of legislation, Parliament set out a list of rights that it thought was particularly important. And it basically said that if a law is passed and people think that law might violate the rights in the Human Rights Act, then it's possible to take that matter to court and for the courts to decide, does this new law actually violate the rights in the Human Rights Act? But that's in the middle of the spectrum there, rather than being over towards the United States end and the end of most democracies. Because if the courts declare that a piece of legislation, a law, is incompatible with the Human Rights Act, that doesn't stop being law. Rather, the matter goes back to Parliament, and Parliament is asked to think again. Do you really want to pass this law that violates the basic rights that you've set out, that Parliament has set out as being important? And Parliament then makes a decision. Do we want the law to stand or not? And generally speaking, Parliament decides to change the law so that it is compatible with the Human Rights Act. So you can see those various different positions that have been taken in the UK and are taken in other countries along that spectrum. And then our final question is on how do we ensure that government ministers act within their powers? So here, the traditional UK model is somewhere more in the middle of the spectrum. So it's always been the case that the courts in the UK have been able to make decisions on whether government ministers are acting within their powers or not. That's always been the case. Traditionally, though, as Chris said, the courts were quite reluctant to use those powers in a very active way. They preferred to defer to what the political representatives, the government and Parliament, had chosen. And their view was basically that, well, if Parliament didn't like what government was doing, then Parliament could always intervene and stop the government from doing that. As Chris said, they've tended to move over time a bit more towards the courts being more active, more activist is a word that is sometimes used, being more willing to stand up to the ministers and government and say, no, actually, you can't do that, that it's outside your powers. And there's a big debate going on at the moment about just where should we lie in this system. Should we welcome the fact that the courts are playing a bigger role now and perhaps are protecting the system against government ministers who try to stretch beyond the powers that they actually have? Or would it be better if we left that more to Parliament to hold government ministers to account? So those are the questions that we're exploring this afternoon, and that's what we've learnt so far about them from the talks this morning, very briefly. So just to sum up, we're thinking, what should be the role of politics in upholding basic principles within our political system? What should be the roles of rules in upholding those basic principles? And what's the best balance between these? Given that no one argues that we should have just politics or just rules, everyone thinks there should be some kind of balance. Just where should that balance lie? And finally, how do our answers to these questions depend on which of the basic principles we have in mind? We might well have a different answer depending on whether we're talking about rights or democratic principles or standards of ethical behavior or whatever it might be. Okay, so that's enough from me. Back now to Kayla.